Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith with everyday life. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Down to Earth Ministry, a ministry of stewardship, a mission of faith, and by the generous support of our patrons. For more information, please visit downtoearthministry.org. That's down, the number 2, earthministry.org. Let's get to it. Welcome to Catholic Feedback, my friends. It's so good to be with you. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. I'm just going to say it. Vatican II. Now, I know some of you gasped with, oh no, we're not going to talk about Vatican II, are we? It's the worst thing in the world. And others of you are like, oh, I love Vatican II. It's so beautiful and it's so inspiring. And then others of you are like, what's Vatican II? Well, today we're going to talk about Vatican II. And I'm especially excited to talk about this today with our guest, Father Blake Britton, because he's written a tremendous book called Reclaiming Vatican II. And this book, in my opinion, is probably the best thing I've ever read about Vatican II, because it helps someone like me who's relatively new to the church understand what this whole thing is all about. It seems like when you become Catholic, you're going to encounter different types of people with regard to how they understand the contemporary nature of the church and what's going on in the church. And everyone agrees that we have some challenges, that we have some problems. And it seems like there is a large group of the population that blames everything wrong with the church on Vatican II. And then there's another part of the population that thinks that Vatican II is a tremendous good and a wonderful thing. What's the correct answer? How are we to understand this? And if you're new to Catholicism, what are you supposed to make of all this stuff? So I'm going to be so blessed to have this conversation with Father Britton. He's from Orlando, Florida. He's written this amazing book. He's also a classically trained operatic singer, I believe. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we'll have some amazing chant in here. Could be amazing. So, Father Britton, welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm so happy that you are here. How you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And I charge extra for the singing, by the way. So
I could. It's probably worth it for me.
No. All joking aside, it is splendid to be with you, and thank you for all that you do for the church. And I'm deeply honored to have this conversation on such an important topic.
Well, it's my honor. And I mean, I feel like I'm just sort of a guy coming into all of this with this perspective of a convert, especially a convert from ministry. And for me, when I came into the Catholic Church just a few years ago, it was almost as if I had this fantasy that when you become Catholic, everyone's going to agree about everything. Everyone's going to be on the same page. And, almost immediately, and maybe even a little bit before I came into the church, I became aware of this sort of divergent view of the Second Vatican Council. And it seems like there's a large group of people in the church that whatever problem there is going on, it's Vatican II's fault.
Right.
And so that was a little troubling for me. And honestly, I didn't understand anything about it. I didn't know anything about the Second Vatican Council. I mean, really, I just knew the general things about it. So, tell us about why you wanted to write this book and how you got involved in this.
Yeah, you tapped into it perfectly and summarized it in your own experience. We have currently in the church these artificial camps or factions that have formed specifically around the topic of the Second Vatican Council for a couple of reasons, one of which I firmly believe is our lack of appreciating the organic nature of the church. And what I mean by that is that the church is not a dead artifact, it's a living organism. She continues to be formed, shaped, inspired by the Holy Spirit throughout the ages. And part of that is going through growing pains. And part of those growing pains is sometimes you're going to have frictions within the church, but that doesn't take away the credibility or the beauty of her essential nature as the bride of Christ. With that in mind, I approached this text firstly when I was a young seminarian. Actually, I was having lunch with an old Irish Monsignor, a delightful man, a priest of our diocese, who was actually present at the Second Vatican Council. And he began to regale me with these stories revolving around Vatican II that were quite impressive. And that began an over 10-year study on the documents of the Second Vatican Council, as well as the many schemas and the different histories and journals that surrounded it. And along the way, as I began to study, I started to recognize that there was a distinction between what the council promoted in its documentation, what it taught, and what was being implemented or promoted in the name of Vatican II on the ground level, or what was being hurled as accusations against the Second Vatican Council. And as I continued studying, I noticed that neither of those attitudes were appropriate. Either those who peddled their own ideologies as the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, nor the false accusations being hurled against Vatican II as the sort of harbinger of death in the life of the church, right? And along that way of study, I was able to identify different trends, which I'm sure we'll get into in a moment in this interview, but different trends that spoke to and helped highlight what had taken place in the past 50 years of Catholicism, as well as the need desperately as a church. Not the first time in history, by the way. This has happened with the Council of Nicaea, Council of Ephesus, Chalcedon, Trent, etc. But the need of the church in our own time to return to the sources of the Second Vatican Council. We need to leave these dichotomies behind. We need to leave these factions behind, these political ideologies, and return to the meat, the bare bones of what the Spirit gave us in Vatican II. And that's really what I'm focusing on in this book.
Yeah, so you mentioned something about, these are things that have happened with other councils in the church. What was the thing that led up to Vatican II in the first place? Because I like when I've studied church history, it's always occurred to me that ecumenical councils were called to deal with a particular problem, namely a heresy or some unclear thing that was going on in the church. So the church comes together in a council to produce a solution to a particular problem.
Right.
I've been told and I've heard that Vatican II is that it's different for some reason, that it wasn't called to refute some kind of heresy, but that it was called for, some sort of like cultural reason. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting narrative because it most certainly was called to combat a heresy, the heresies of atheism, the heresies of secularism, materialism, communism, socialism, these different trends that had been rising in the previous century leading up to the Second World War and thereafter in the Korean conflict and the Cold War. So there are most certainly trends in secularism that the Second Vatican Council is addressing, although it does so in a different kind of tone. So to give a context, if you will, to the development of councils and then going specifically to the historical development of Vatican II. Firstly, you're right in saying that throughout the church, there are always two reasons for a council: catechetical, dogmatic, and pastoral. Always. The Council of Nicaea, for example, clarifies the existence of Christ, clarifies the creed, the teachings of the church. But that is not only a dogmatic concern, that's also a pastoral concern because you had heretics spreading false teaching. You had people not knowing who Christ was. You had this usurping that was taking place of the dignity of the human person, the validation of the incarnation of Jesus. These are pastoral concerns as well as dogmatic concerns. So we always have to be careful. And that's one of the things I disagree with about this narrative in Vatican II, separating the pastoral from the theological. They always exist together. Christ was not a pastor and then a theologian. He was a theologian and a pastor together. It's always the truth and its application coincide hand in hand. With that now in the back of our mind, we're able to approach the topic of Vatican II. And really to appreciate the Second Vatican Council, we have to realize it didn't fall out of thin air. Another one of these false narratives is that somehow it's a new age kind of council. It just came out with all these new age spiritualities and ideas, which is absolutely false. In fact, the Second Vatican Council was preceded by over 2 centuries of historical, theological, and ecclesiological development, not least of which is rooted in what we call the ressourcement movement. That's a French word meaning ressourcement or return to the sources. And there's a new field of archaeology being developed in the centuries preceding Vatican II. This is called archaeology. Archaeology, the study of the ancient world, digging up the pyramids of Giza and finding documentation from the cuneiform and all these different ways of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians. And along with that, also, there's a revival of biblical theology, archaeological biblical study, mainly through Protestant and Catholic scholars together, not least of which was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this also coincided with the discovery of the patristic text. These are the writings of the first several centuries of Catholicism, the writings of the apostolic fathers, the 12 apostles and their successors, people like Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch, and then leading also to the early centuries of the patristic period, which is 2nd, 3rd, going up to the 8th and 10th centuries AD. This is where you get a lot of the Eastern fathers: Germanus of Constantinople, Augustine of Hippo, Basil of Caesarea. As the church is sort of opening up this time capsule, if you will, of these early apostolic, patristic, and biblical sources, it leads to a renovation, a renewal of theology above and beyond just Thomism, and going now also to this pastorism, this return to the font, the original impetus of the Christian experience, this Christian encounter with Jesus from her first disciples. And as the church is studying this, they come to realize the need, if you will, to reintegrate these understandings of the church into the wider consciousness of Catholics overall, especially when it was in regard to liturgy and academic studies. All that combined together, and then leading to, of course, the post-Enlightenment secularism, militant atheism, and then eventually communism, socialism, and the fallout of that from the First and Second World Wars. The church realized we have this gem that's been hewed from the apostolic, patristic, and biblical archaeology that needs to be integrated into the consciousness of the church. But also, we have this world that's been devastated by secularism, devastated by this notion that somehow God should not be the center of civilization. And Vatican II arises to address both of those issues, which I think is articulated wonderfully in its closing document, Gaudium et Spes, which is summarized in joy and hope. Those are the two things the Second Vatican Council wanted to bring back into the world again, a world that was shattered by its own powers through nuclear warfare, through mechanized warfare, through socialism. Now the church is seeking to bring joy and hope, to breathe it back into the lungs of the human species. And it does this, of course, by reacquainting it with its origin, which is Jesus Christ the Lord. And that has to be centered in the liturgy, has to be centered in ecclesiological identity, which is identity of the church, the sacred scriptures and tradition, and evangelization.
So that to me sounds beautiful. It sounds to me like this is more of like almost an evangelistic kind of council, that
Very much.
in the sense that it is focused on how do we bring the message of the gospel into a world that is rapidly changing, rapidly embracing all of this modernism and all of this naturalism and atheism, as you're talking about communism, all these things going on in the world. The church is trying to interact with these things. Yet that, to me, that's ironic, because one of the things that people often point to as a negative result of Vatican II is how the church seems to have become more like the modern atheist,
Right.
naturalistic world.
Right.
Well, how does that happen? How do we go from, because like I said, it sounds like the church is reaching into the world to say, okay, we're going to help you to find the Lord, and to not veer so far away from the truths of just natural law and divine revelation. But yet what seems to have happened, according to some, is that almost had a negative effect, and the church, in an attempt to reach out to the world, was grabbed a hold of by the world and
Right.
suffering the consequences.
Yeah, very legitimate critique, by the way. Although it's the blame is put into the wrong place, the observation is correct. There most certainly grew a mentality of worldliness, specifically in the clergy of the church, in the several decades following the Second Vatican Council, and that's rooted in one of the main theses of my book, which is called the Paracouncil. The Paracouncil.
I thought that was
So,
very helpful. The way that you kind of distinguish between like the paracouncil and then I think you said like the traditionalists or something, and these, like, talk
right.
about these two groups and how you describe them in your book.
Absolutely. This is what I think is most important about my book, is the terminology that it revitalizes through the inspiration of people like Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger, aka Pope Benedict XVI. But I was trying to understand myself. Okay, I'm reading something in Vatican II that is awesome. This stuff is amazing. But then I go to my local parish and it's like, oh, that's not too amazing, right? Like some of the things I'm seeing, some things I'm hearing promoted about Vatican II, or in the quote unquote spirit of Vatican II,
Yeah.
that just doesn't seem to mesh with what the documents taught. So that reoriented my study away from just looking at the documents themselves and now going to answering this question: what happened to disconnect the documents from the implementation phase? And as I studied that, I stumbled across an article by a wonderful French Jesuit theologian named Henri de Lubac, really one of the great scholars of the 20th century. And he has an article entitled The Paracouncil. The Paracouncil. It's in an appendix in one of his little books on nature and grace. And in there, he says, within a decade of the closing session of Vatican II, so we're talking the late 60s, early 70s, there are these theologians who have deputized themselves as interpreters of the Second Vatican Council, who are disappointed with Vatican II because in their mind it was far too conservative. It did not make the radical ideological changes that they thought it should have. And so what do? They take advantage of mass media. They take advantage of those who trust them. They take advantage of the opportunity to go out and to implement the Second Vatican Council, not to actually do what the council said to do, but rather to implement their own ideologies of what they thought the council should have done under the auspices, wearing the mask, if you will, of the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And this was repeated multiple times, leading to our current period, in which now you have this whole narrative that somehow not saying Latin in the Mass is pro Vatican II, or that you're more Vatican II if you do life team music in the Mass, but not Vatican II if you do the Latin in the Mass. When both there's room for both of these things, right, within the context of the sacred liturgy. And the Second Vatican Council is adamant, anyways, on the tradition, the preservation of Latin within the Latin rite of the church. So this happened through three main avenues, if you will, that I've articulated and studied that give rise to the paraconciliar narrative. First, you have the Council of the Theologians. Once again, these theologians such as Edward Schillebeeckx, Hans Kung, who after the Second Vatican Council, they take advantage of the implementation period not to implement Vatican II, but to begin a narrative on what they thought Vatican II should be, or to, as they said, continue on the spirit of reform within the council, ad experimentum, to experiment with the liturgy, to experiment with theology, and to push the boundaries of the Christian religion in order to promote what they thought Vatican II should have done. That then is picked up by the media. We cannot underappreciate the fact that the Second Vatican Council is the first ever Catholic council, the first ever council of the Universal Church to be covered by mass media, specifically American mass media, which always interprets reality through the lens of conservative and liberal. This is the first time in church history when those labels have been placed upon the church. We never had liberal and conservative Catholics before the 60s and 70s, before the mass media started covering the Catholic Church. But all of a sudden, they start treating Catholicism like they do politics between Republicans and Democrats. Now you have liberal bishops, quote unquote, versus conservative bishops, quote unquote. And you're in one of these two camps. You're either a progressive Catholic or you're a conservative Catholic. Well, neither of those are Catholics. Neither of those are Catholic categories. Jesus Christ not found conservative branch or liberal branch. He founded the Catholic Church. So there's only orthodoxy or unorthodoxy. Those are actually Catholic categories, as Chesterton will point out, but not liberal and conservative. Unfortunately, nowadays, even a lot of Catholics fall into the trap, especially well-known Catholics on their commentators or YouTube, whatever that might be, of distinguishing the church into liberal and conservative or progressive and traditional. Those are not good categorizations. We can't have those at odds. And add on to that, of course, the time period in which Vatican II is being implemented, the 60s and 70s, which is a revolutionary time period in world history in general. We had the Vietnam War, the space race, the Cold War, etc. There's a lot of things happening. And this paraconciliar narrative, which usurped the authentic vision of Vatican II, was in lockstep with the spirit of the age, with the council of the age. They were like, whoa, here's these priests, here's these theologians coming out saying the Catholic Church is even getting hip with the times. The Catholic Church is even sort of ripping off the shackles of the old world, so to speak. And that wasn't true at all. We know the Second Vatican Council is very much rooted in the continuation of discernment and tradition of the church. And now what you're starting to see, which is even scarier, is some people admitting that and just rejecting it anyways. So what's happened, not just through my book in Reclaiming Vatican II, but I think mainly through Joseph Ratzinger, through Pope Benedict, and a raising of a larger consciousness of this problem of the paracouncil, is that you have my generation, millennial Catholics and Gen Z Catholics, starting to smell the coffee and say, wait a second, I don't think Vatican II is what you say it is. There's something more to this. And now you have some of these theologians, teachers sort of ripping off their mask and saying, yeah, you're right. Actually, it isn't what Vatican II says, but I still think the church should change anyways. And so I'm going to ban this, or I'm going to suppress this, or I'm going to do this, even though it's not condemned by the documents of Vatican II. So I'm happy to see that in some ways, because again, the mask has been ripped off, but it also sort of betrays this underlining false narrative, if you will, that's alive about Vatican II that needs to be reconciled and reclaimed.
Okay, so in just a second, I want to go through some of these misconceptions that people have, but I want to react to a couple things that you said. First of all, I 100% struggle with that segmentation and the delineation between, traditional Catholic, whatever. So I go to the Latin Mass. But the way I found the Latin Mass, Father, wasn't because I was combing through the documents of the Council of Trent and comparing them with the Council of Vatican II, going, oh, this one's better, so I'm going to this Mass. I kind of found it by accident and fell in love with it.
Yeah.
And, because I do that, some people call me, oh, well, you're a traditional Catholic.
Yep.
And I considered myself a traditional Catholic the day I joined the Catholic Church, because to me, traditional Catholicism is about being obedient to the magisterium of the church, to being part of the body of Christ. And so to me, like, the most traditional thing is obedience to the church, not necessarily being attached to things from the past that may or may not have variations or changes.
Right.
Now I do personally, I am more attracted to the traditional aspects of Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that was just a better fit. But I don't like these labels that we put on each other. So, as a convert, that was a struggle for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It is incredibly dangerous because you box people in, and also you shoot yourself in the foot, metaphorically speaking, insofar as you're not able now to dialogue between these two things. The Second Vatican Council did not explicitly suppress the extraordinary form of the liturgy. In fact, as Pope Benedict will clarify, the vision is for a cooperation, an organic development of the liturgy in cooperation with the Missal of Paul VI. So it's not like you have the Latin Mass and then another Mass. They're both actually the Latin Mass. It's just one is Latin Mass on the ordinary form and one is Latin Mass on the extraordinary form. And we should be able to celebrate both of these liturgies interchangeably as Latin Rite Catholics. This is not something that is unheard of, even with Pius V after the reforms of the Council of Trent. There was a time period in which he is slowly implementing the missal of the Council of Trent alongside other medieval missals or other missals that were extant during that period. And there's not just this explicit hard break suppression of all previous liturgies, but rather there needs to be a respectful, truly pastoral, not pastoral in the sense of this artificial notion of being pastoral, but truly to be pastoral to the people of God who have a deep love for the Council of Trent's Mass, for the Trentonian Mass, which is a Catholic Mass. It's part of our history, just like the Ambrosian Rite, just like the Syro-Malabar Rite, any of these other rites or practices of the faith. We also have now the Ordinary of the Chair of St. Peter. So these ordinariate missions that are forming, all these are expressions that are authentic of the Latin liturgy. So with the extraordinary form, it is sad for me to see that these political labels have put these two communities at odds on both sides. So in the traditionalist area, you have this hyper criticism of anything that is not the extraordinary form of the liturgy, which of course is inappropriate. But also on the progressivist, quote unquote, the paraconciliarist part of the church, you have this criticism of saying that those who attend the extraordinary form are somehow schismatic or somehow not in step with the Second Vatican Council, which is absolutely false. That's not true at all.
So this goes to my other thing I was going to talk to you about with this is the paracouncil. These people who decided to, and I can't remember if you used this exact wording, but I've used it oftentimes in my own conversations. They basically decided to hijack the council. Mm-hmm. And they have their progressive liberal modern ideas, and they want to use the council to put them forth.
Right.
Why didn't the church stamp that out right away and say, sorry, you can't do that. That's not what the council was about. Why was this allowed? Why is it allowed to basically just run rampant throughout the church when according to what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing with you at all.
Yeah.
What you're saying, that wasn't really what Vatican II was about.
Yeah. It's one of those things to where we try to do too much too fast. And it really did happen quickly. So this is a question that I've struggled with for a while now. And of course, there's no perfect answer, but I can tell you this. It was not as if St. Paul VI, for example, was complicit in this misimplementation of the Second Vatican Council. It's not as if St. John Paul II or Pope Benedict were. A matter of fact, St. Paul VI, Pope John Paul II, and Pope Benedict all wrote documentation condemning the misimplementation of the Second Vatican Council. Paul VI publishes a little booklet after Vatican II entitled Jubilate Deo, which exhorts the bishops to teach the lay faithful the Latin language and to preserve Latin within the Latin liturgy. St. John Paul II writes several apostolic exhortations, letters, and encyclicals reflecting on the liturgical abuses that had taken place and saying how they're contradictory to the true spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And of course, Pope Benedict is probably the greatest defender of Vatican II and the sacred liturgy, not least of which is his writing Summotum Pontificum. So it's not that it went under the radar necessarily, but what happened is that you did have large swaths of these paraconciliar thinkers influencing generations of priests. One of the main places that they targeted was seminaries. And in these seminaries, you had, and I've had by admission from some of my brother priests who are a little bit older than myself, saying that they went through all of seminary and never read a single Vatican II document. Instead, they were told what Vatican II taught. They were told and sort of led to believe, if you will, and some of them say that begrudgingly because now they feel deceived, but they were led to believe what Vatican II wanted. So one of my good friends, actually, he is in a religious order, and he was saying how when he was in formation, he's older, much older than I am, when he was in formation in the 60s and 70s, that his formators encouraged him to get a girlfriend while he's in formation because Vatican II wanted to change celibacy in the priesthood. That's what Vatican II was doing. But Vatican II never said that. But while he was in seminary, all the other seminarians were getting girlfriends because that's what they were being told Vatican II taught. You see, so this was something that was happening in places all around the world. And all you need are 1 to 2 generations of that, and you have a lot of white influence over the church. To take this in a different arena that I think is correlative, look at our American educational system. Look at our university system. In 2 generations in this country, they've been able to manipulate and brainwash millions of our kids into different secularist mentalities. And while we may have been off working or what have you, what were some of these people doing? They were becoming middle school teachers. They were becoming librarians. They were writing books. They were editing the textbooks that are used in universities and colleges and our public educational systems. And now we're at this point where we have these ideological wars going on within our education system as a result. And that only took 2 generations. So same thing happened with the Second Vatican Council. As long as you get 1 or 2 generations of priests, 1 or 2 generations of religious, 1 or 2 generations of Catholic school students, this is able to proliferate very quickly, and it's hard to put it out. So now we're arriving at the point to where we're able to recognize where the failures happened, also recognize the successes, because there are many wonderful things that were implemented quite well in the Second Vatican Council phase. So I don't want to make it seem like the Para Council won the day. They didn't. There are many things that were done wonderfully. Look at something even as simple as World Youth Day. That would not be possible without the Second Vatican Council. Look at something as beneficial and beautiful as these mass Eucharistic adorations, or as these sort of tele-evangelizations. What we're doing right now is in perfect correlation to Gaudium et Spes and its writings on evangelization through media. So there's a lot of things that Vatican II implemented, the lectionary cycle with the liturgy, the 3-year lectionary cycle for sacred scriptures, all these sort of things that were absolutely superb. So it would be unfair to say that it was a complete disaster, the implementation phase, but it is a fair critique to say that this is something that was proliferated, the paraconciliar ideologies, very quickly, and only now are we starting to wake up to it.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about your brother priest who was being told Vatican II says, liberalism, where guys like me who are new to the church coming in, we're being told the opposite.
Right.
Okay. We're being told, and this is kind of, I wanted to walk through some of this because I bet you a lot of people in our audience here today who are exploring Catholicism or are new to Catholicism are encountering these exact same things. And I think this is where a lot of the issues come from the other side. So here's some things that I've been told the Vatican II says, and you can just kind of maybe knock them down or say, yep, that's what it says.
Sure.
That Vatican II banned ad orientem worship.
No, it did not.
Okay. That Vatican II basically prescribed that any new churches that were built must be built in the round and not traditional and look like, hexagonal shaped or whatever.
No, it did not.
It tells us we need to remove sacred images and icons and statues from our parishes.
No, it did not.
That we need to get rid of the tabernacle from the middle of the church and put it down the hall someplace in a different room.
Absolutely not.
That we can't have Gregorian chant. That we can't use Latin in the Mass.
Nope.
I mean, there's lots of things, and I'm sure, obviously, I know you're aware of these things, but I'm just telling, like, these are all things that people on, the quote unquote traditionalist side will tell people, well, yeah, the problem is what I can do at Vatican II. All these, there were these evil people there that their desire was to hijack the church, and they did so through Vatican II, and it's a complete disaster. And then at the end of the day, Paul VI says that, well, it doesn't really count anyway because it's not a dogmatic. We said no dogmatic things.
Right.
So, so then you even hear people saying, well, we don't even have to really pay attention to Vatican II. It could all just be wiped out by Vatican III or whatever.
Right. So to answer all those things sort of in succession, wonderful. Thank you for bringing them up because they are very common misconceptions. Firstly, you had the Paracouncil take place, which takes away from the real dignity of Vatican II. As a response to that, you will have then a traditionalist movement arise within the Catholic Church. Now, the most well-known person of that is Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who founded the SSPX, which in the beginning was a canonical order of the Catholic Church. It was not schismatic in any way, shape, or form. And mind you, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre signed the documentation of Vatican II. He approved of the liturgical reforms.
That's always made
me disagreed.
Talk about that. I've always thought, wait a second, he was there.
Yes.
Signed them. So the documents themselves, and you talk about this right in the beginning of your book, which I think is a fantastic point, Father. You said, the point you make in the beginning of this book is most of the people, and I know we can't say for sure specifics, but the vast majority of people who act like they know everything about Vatican II and can criticize it and say all the things that, like the misconceptions, they've probably never, ever even read the actual document. Yep. They've just heard people who say what they say, kind of like your liberal priests in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly. Fulton J. Sheen once said very cleverly, he said, there aren't 100 people in the world who hate the Catholic Church, but there are millions who think they hate the Catholic Church. And the same thing is true of Vatican II. You can't find 100 people in the world that actually disagree with Vatican II, but there are millions who disagree with what they think Vatican II taught, with what they think Vatican II says. And that's most certainly what's happening in traditionalism. They don't actually disagree with Vatican II. They disagree with their idea of Vatican II or what's been presented to them or told to them about the Second Vatican Council. So this traditionalist movement rises up as a response to this paraconciliar movement. So you see what's happened here. What's happened here is, and that's why I say these are two artificial movements. What I mean by that is that they're both unnecessary. If we were just to return to the Second Vatican Council, we wouldn't have these factions whatsoever. What's happened is that you have a false Vatican II, a paraconciliar version of Vatican II, and then you have a very legitimate response to that, which we now call traditionalism, which if this was Vatican II, if paraconciliarism really was Vatican II, I'd be fighting against it as well. So I'm not saying that the critiques of traditionalism are wrong. They're correct. They're just not at Vatican II. They're at paraconciliarism. So that's the rest of the distinction that we have to draw. Now, with that in mind, going to your question, there's a few perfect examples. Vatican II did not ban ad orientem explicitly within the general instruction of the Roman Missal of the Missal of St. Paul VI. It presumes that the priest is facing ad orientem. That is in the rubrics. Look at rubric 275, for example, in the Roman Missal, and it's very clear that the priest then turns and faces the people, meaning that he was not facing the people to begin with. So the rubric gives instruction for him to turn around whenever it's time to offer the sign of peace and say, the Lord be with you. And then he has to turn back around and face the sanctuary for the fraction of the host. So there's explicit instruction within the missal that presumes ad orientem. Same thing with Latin Gregorian chant and architecture. The Second Vatican Council actually exhorts pastors, says that they have a pastoral obligation, not option, obligation to instruct their faithful in the Latin language, to teach them about Gregorian chant, to teach them artistic and architectural value and beauty. This is what the Second Vatican Council calls, quite poetically, the liturgical apostolate. And we as priests are pastorally obligated under the Ecumenical Council's law to implement this. And if we don't do so, we are failing pastorally. That's the gravity with which Vatican II approaches the Latin language and also these other aspects of the beauty of our tradition and faith. So yeah, those are very false hurdles that unfortunately have been placed in front of people, and I hope to remove in this book and as I continue speaking and promoting the true message of the Second Vatican Council.
So there's two more that I want to bring up to you.
Sure.
Communion on the hand versus communion on the tongue. Talk about that for a second. Is there Vatican II somewhere where it says, hey, let's just have at it with communion on the hand and turn people away if they come up to receive on the tongue?
Yeah, not part of Vatican II whatsoever. What had happened is that this was already being implemented in several European countries. There was sort of this movement to return to communion on the hand. We do have patristic and apostolic documentation to where there was communion on the hand in the early apostolic church, but it was very different. You can't. A lot of times, some liturgists will try to equate the apostolic patristic church with the contemporary church, and it was a very different form of the sacred liturgy. There's no reason to justify reception on the hand in the same way that you would in the apostolic or patristic liturgies. But that being said, reception on the hand is what we call an indult. So an indult is ideally a temporary permission that's given with the hope of reaching a better ideal. And when St. Paul VI grants the indult for reception on the hand, he does so with the intention, with the presumption that the ideal will be achieved, which would be returning to the traditional form of reception in the Latin Rite, which is reception kneeling on the tongue. Either way, this is currently allowed by the bishops. They do have authority to allow that, and that's something to where me as a priest, I don't want to overstep my boundaries or be hypercritical of the episcopacy in any way. I am an obedient son of the church. But that being said, it is also inappropriate to say that receiving kneeling on the tongue is not within the jurisdiction of Vatican II, because it most certainly is. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the vision of receiving communion kneeling on the tongue is what Vatican II envisioned as well. If it was going to change something as radical, and this is a point I mentioned to some of my friends who are liturgists or theologians that may disagree with me, if the Second Vatican Council was to make such a radical change as how we receive Holy Communion after over 500 years of receiving communion a certain way, if the Second Vatican Council was to make such a radical change as suppressing ad orientem, which has been a fundamental form of Christian prayer since the Last Supper, Jesus himself faced ad orientem at the Last Supper when he was facing the Temple of Jerusalem. So if they were going to do something as radical as that, do you not think they would have explicitly mentioned it in the Constitution on the sacred liturgy? Or they would have explicitly mentioned it in one of the post-conciliar implementation documents? And
So
it's not. It
they're
is
in
not
there.
suppressed. It's not mentioned in any way, shape, or form. So how can you justify this change? How can you say this was in the mind of the fathers when you're making such a radical change, such a fundamental Christian expression of prayer and piety, when it's not mentioned at all by them? That's a hard pill for me to swallow.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like if you follow that logic, you could just as easily blame any document the church has produced in the
Right.
past on. You could say this. I mean, if you're telling me, and I believe it, that there's nothing in there that says that,
Mhm.
then we have to place the blame somewhere else other than Vatican II. Okay, here's the second one.
Sure.
The Novus Ordo. Okay, the Novus Ordo Mass is I've been told by people, and I think I understand the reality, but I've been told by people that the Second Vatican Council created the Novus Ordo Mass and implemented the Novus Ordo Mass, which always seemed weird to me since that didn't come out until after years later. But
Right.
talk about the relationship between Vatican II and the Novus Ordo, and
Sure.
how that came about.
Yeah, great question. Of course, to appreciate the Novus Ordo, and this is one of my little pet peeves, I think is important to help us respect both missals. So you have the Missal of St. Paul VI and the Missal of St. Pius V, or more appropriately, it's actually the Missal of St. John the 23rd, which is now used in the extraordinary form because John the 23rd reformed the Missal of Pius V. There were a lot of liturgical abuses as well as a lot of things going on within the Missal of Pius V previously. And so John the 23rd, as well as other saints, St. Pius X and what have you, had saw reasons to have liturgical reforms, Pius XII. So to pretend as if everything was hunky-dory before Vatican II and then Vatican II sort of ruined the liturgy is very false. There's
Right.
already a liturgical reform taking place under Pius X, Pius XII, Pius XI, then leading ultimately up to John the 23rd and Paul VI, and then to the Ecumenical Council itself. So there was much need for reform really in the century and a half preceding the Second Vatican Council, and Vatican II is just sort of the crowning diadem of that. So you have the Missal of Pius the Fifth / John the 23rd, and then the Missal of Paul VI. Both are legitimate missals within the ordinary and extraordinary form. So both legitimate missals in the Latin Rite. And that's why I try to get rid of the language of I go to the Latin Mass or I go to the Novus Ordo, because they're actually both the Latin Mass. It's just Missal Paul VI or Missal John the 23rd. I go to the Mass of John the 23rd or the Mass of Paul VI. Why am I so adamant on that? Because that will now allow us, because that will now allow us the freedom to say Latin should be spoken in both. Ad orientem should be in both. See, if you draw too hard of a line between the Novus Ordo and the extraordinary form, or the quote unquote Latin Mass, what you're doing now is saying that the traditions which are prevalent within the previous form of liturgical expression, aka the Council of Trent, are no longer valid within the new form of liturgical expression. However, as Ratzinger points out so clearly, there's supposed to be an organic continuation between missals. So you're supposed to have this organic development, and there should be trappings that are maintained within the ordinary form and the extraordinary form, and they should cross-reference one another. So as far as the development of the Missal of Paul VI itself, it's put together by a post-conciliar commission. Pope Benedict XVI, John Paul II, de Lubac, von Balthasar, Yves Congar, they're all very clear in saying that a lot of these post-conciliar liturgists took liberties and implementing things that they agreed with or personally wanted, but were not ideal. That being said, the claim that the Missal of Paul VI is somehow not traditional, of course, is untrue, because it's actually very close to the ancient apostolic and patristic liturgies. The ancient liturgies of the church were the main inspiration for the reforms of Vatican II, because we had rediscovered the liturgy of St. Peter, the liturgy of St. James, the liturgy of Basil Caesarea, some of these ancient forms of celebrating the sacred liturgy. And this is what now allows the Missal of Paul VI to become a more streamlined sense of liturgy that, according to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is more able to evangelize, to speak to the needs of contemporary society. That's not to say the Holy Spirit isn't present, obviously, in the Missal of John the 23rd. He most certainly is. But there's also this need within the church always, and we hear this from the church fathers when they say, Ecclesia semper reformata, the church is always in reform. The church must constantly contemplate upon herself, contemplate upon her expression of the faith, which we call the liturgy, to discern how can I allow the liturgy to speak to what this age needs most. Now, where this fell into a trap, of course, was when you had certain liturgists saying, well, what the world needs most is pop music. What the world needs most is hip preaching, is dancing in front of the altar. Well, Vatican II didn't say any of those things. What it did say, however, is what the world needs most is a rekindling in the fundamental and simple expression of the faith. See, we no longer live in Christendom. Christendom is gone. We lived off of it for over 800 years, and that's wonderful, but it's over. Now we're entering into a new apostolic age. We're entering into a neo-paganistic society, a post-Christian world. And there has to be a liturgy that's able to speak to that world intimately and deeply, a liturgy that's able to allow that world to integrate into itself, and then also to be subsumed in some ways and to be cooperative with the extraordinary expression of the liturgy, the Missal of John the 23rd. And that's why, I firmly believe that moving forward, at least for the next several decades of church history, there needs to be an active communication and active cooperation between these two missals in the methods of evangelization.
The hard thing for me listening to this, Father, is, as a guy who attends the Latin Mass, who loves the Latin Mass, when you talk about how this is part of the church and it's beautiful, and then you mentioned how we can't, if we draw these hard lines between the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, then we're basically saying that those older traditions aren't applicable at all to what we're doing now. But that's kind of what it feels like is happening right now.
Right.
With regard to Traditionis Custodes, and I'm not a Pope basher. I'm not one of these guys that is all about rebelling against the bishops and the church. I'm trying to be the best Catholic I can be. And it's just hard when, I agree with what you're saying. I feel that when I read this book, I was like, okay, how do I sign up? Because this sounds awesome. Where do we go from here? But it feels like there's such a disconnect swinging the other way so far that it seems like what Pope Francis wants to do is completely eliminate the Tridentine Mass and
so let me address that. That's a great point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because this is a serious pastoral issue.
Yeah.
We have millions of Catholics who love the extraordinary form, and I've been very disappointed actually with the pastoral response to our brothers and sisters who are part of the extraordinary form, because they're children of God too. And we often hear talk about how we should be patient and pastoral and kind with someone who, for example, who has same-sex attraction or is struggling with transgenderism. And we're so excited to sort of minister to them and think ourselves evangelists. And I don't disagree with that. I minister to people who struggle with those things, but to not have the same kind of patience, kindness, loving accompaniment, if you will, with those who are traditionalists is something that's off-putting to my own heart. And so I try to be equal with everyone. I'll be just as pastoral on all sides. So I want to address this issue directly that you brought up, because I think it's vitally important and we don't hear it spoken about enough. So there are two sides to this coin. The one is that there's not an explicit expression of the extraordinary form. It is done under very strict circumstances. And of course, there's an obedience that needs to be done alongside of that. So we have that component. However, in light of your comment on the Novus Ordo, I believe this is a splendid opportunity for us to reclaim the dignity of the Missal of Paul VI. See, the Missal of St. Paul VI is actually an extraordinarily beautiful liturgy when it is done appropriately, when it's done according to the ideal of the church. And unfortunately, in many of our parishes, it is not. It is done either sort of half-heartedly or even in some cases illicitly. And that, I'm not saying that's intentional, I'm not saying that's malicious, but I think it's just part of the consequences of that periconciliar education that's now gone down through several generations and been filtered through to what we have nowadays. So when you have people kids that don't even know how to chant the sacrum, the tantum ergo, that's something that's so tragic, and most certainly not in the vision of Vatican II. So I do see the publication of this document by the Holy Father also as an opportunity for us to start working towards having more dignified liturgies that incorporate Latin, that incorporate Ad Orientem, that incorporate the traditions of the church within the Missal of Paul VI, and see what we can do to maybe bridge this gap a little bit more that's being divided. The last comment I'll make about that is, throughout church history, there are times when we have these tensions, either between the hierarchy, the clergy, and the laity, or maybe the laity are doing something and the hierarchy has to discipline them. And there is part of this that is disciplinary, to be fair on all sides. You cannot be a priest that goes up to the pulpit and says Pope Francis is not the real pope, right? And so there's some of these priests who have been imprudent, and some of these traditionalists who have been imprudent and disrespectful and dishonorable. And so we have to recognize that sinfulness as well, just as much as we do on the other side. But that being said, anytime that this kind of thing happens in the church, what is the response that the Holy Spirit always inspires? Saints. And this amazes me, the beauty of Christ and his wisdom, that he raises up men and women, he raises up a generation even sometimes, who suffer the sting and the blow of the church, as Origen will say, who recognizes that she is black but beautiful, and quoting from the Song of Songs, while at the same time persevering with the spirit of joy, not resentment and bitterness, but holding their base. And the same thing is true of me. I'm very much one who I'm not going to go out and be openly or explicitly disrespectful or sinful or arrogant in any way. But I most certainly am going to hold my ground, and so far as what the church teaches, and so far as the wisdom of the church, while also maintaining a humility to be open to grow and to better understand. Maybe I do misunderstand something. Maybe I don't have a full appreciation of the mystery of the church, and that's why I'm willing to dialogue with whomever at any time. But that being said, I think as we move forward as a church, it's going to be very important for us to spend less energy sort of hurling things and more energy sort of burrowing in, if you will, and focusing on growing in piety, growing in holiness, latching on to the tried and true traditions of our faith, and waiting out the storm, so to speak, in order to allow the Holy Spirit to do his work. So do not be despairing. Do not fall into fear or to callousness. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. This is all part of the growing pains of the church. And when in doubt, as St. Teresa of Avila says, she said, if you have a choice between being right and being obedient, choose obedience.
Wow.
And so for me, that's also something that I choose. I would rather allow the Holy Father to slap me in the face than for me to spit in his. That's just the kind of man that I am. That's what I want to be. I mean, that's what Jesus asks us to be. And if we have a church of people who are willing to suffer that, and I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying that that is something that's just, but it is something that's beautiful. It's something that's holy. If we're able to be that kind of humble servant of not just the Holy Father, but of just the church in general to all people. And so that's also something else I learned from Origen. I learned from Catherine of Siena. I learned from Teresa of Avila, some of these great saints who were persecuted in their own lifetime. And I think that kind of spirit needs to be renewed in us as well.
Well, I appreciate that. And I hear in your voice I think kind of a kindred idea that I have with, of wanting to do whatever it takes to maintain holiness and obedience,
Right.
and not the thing that always bothers me, Father, is when on whether you're a liberal or a conservative, when you have to run anything that's going on through your own opinion and filter to decide whether it's legit or not. I mean, in
Mhm.
essence, that's Protestantism. You know,
Right.
it's to say, well, I agree with what the church says or does until I don't.
Right.
And then when I
Right.
don't, then it's wrong. You
Yep.
know? And I go, wait a minute, that's what I came out of.
Right.
Bothers me. Like, I guess I have like a spidey sense about that because that's what I came out of for so many years. And that was the thing that drove me to Catholicism, honestly,
Mm.
was that seems so wrong to me. And I honestly, I see it on both sides. I think that's one of the reasons I resonated with your book is because you know, you talk about the errors on both sides of this
Mhm.
issue. And so I appreciate your perspective on that. I want to ask this question. Um,
Sure.
like, where do we go from here as far as,
Yeah.
I mean, the title of your book, Reclaiming Vatican II, is that done by thinking about it? Or is there like a
Mm.
way to do this
Yeah.
beyond just people reading the documents and going, okay, I see what it says, but how do we in fact move past this weird area of the paracouncil and the traditionalism mindset into really what the documents talk about and
Yeah.
how do we do that?
Great question. So my father's a Marine, and I come from military family. So I always think of things strategically. My prisoners say Father Blake's always playing 4D chess, right? So we have to approach this with the battle kind of mindset. And in my opinion, it's a three-stage sort of assault. So the first thing is always personal holiness. And I'm learning this directly from the first bishop of our country, Bishop John Carroll, a really incredible man. If you don't know very much about him, I strongly encourage you to research him. He's absolutely phenomenal. But Bishop John Carroll, when he was named Bishop of the United States of America, at that time the youngest newly formed country in the world, and the first ever country to try this crazy experiment called republicanism, having this liberal society in the traditional sense, meaning a free people who are self-governing, led by the United States. And he now has to govern this people who are underfunded, undereducated. The clergy is very poor and doesn't really understand the liturgy, and the piety among the laity is just disastrous. So what does John Carroll do? Number one, he realizes the personal holiness of his clergy has to come first. And that's what I would say is step one to reclaiming Vatican II. We need holy priests. We need priests who know what Vatican II teaches. We need priests who have suffered through the forge of holiness, who are men of prayer, of chastity, of obedience and holiness, who have a fire burning in their gut for the gospel and the truth. And what can laity do to help out with that? You need to raise these priests in your homes with your sons. You need to pray for these priests through fasting and through personal mortification and penance. So that's number one, is that we need an army of holy clergy and well-formed clergy. And John Carroll recognized that, and he used that to help reform the church.
Okay,
Number two, education.
hold on.
Yes.
That was awesome. Okay, I don't want to lose that track for a second because what you just said, again, something I've never heard before, is because I've heard people say we need holy priests, you know, blah blah. And I'm like, yes, but what you just said, I think, is huge. You said we need to raise them,
Yes.
and I think about all of the kids that attend the parish I go to, the little kids everywhere, you know, and I'm so
Yep.
thankful for all these parents that do all of the work required to bring their kids to mass and do what they have to do to bring up their kids in the faith. And I just want to say that is incredibly encouraging that is part of the solution because we're raising these young men up to be the priests that can make that change. So that's,
Yes.
you know, I just wanted to shout amen right there, Father, if that's okay.
Amen. Amen, brother. I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. And
Sorry to
that's
jump
something
in
that's
there.
been no worries. That's something that's amazing for me to witness. One of the privileges I have, not just as a parish priest, but also as a priest who is able to work and do things with Word on Fire and to publish and to write, to speak, is that I'm seeing a generation of young adults who are now starting to have children that are really raising holy kids, especially holy boys. And these boys want to be priest, and not just in
Yeah.
this idealistic kind of childish way. Like, they are dead serious about this. One of my dear friends, their little boy, he's like my little apprentice, I call him. You know, he's my shadow whenever I go over to their house. But while I'm celebrating mass at their home, he will literally have out his mass kit, or he'll get into a chasuble that his mother made him, and he will go word for word. I mean, he knows the liturgy through and through, and he loves it. And God forbid, God forbid, if I don't have the right thing set in the missal, because this
Oh,
because
wow.
this 5 or 6-year-old will call me out, and it's just amazing. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that's where it starts, because then the church can pick that up, but it has to start in the home first. St. John Paul II said, the home is the first seminary. And it's so true. The home is the first seminary. So number 2,
Yeah.
education. Ignorance, of course, is a proliferate monster, as Shakespeare quotes in his wonderful works. Ignorance is a very dangerous thing. Not knowing what we believe, and of course that extends to the Second Vatican Council. We need to educate ourselves on Vatican II, and if you want a quick way to reclaim Vatican II, start spreading the word about reclaiming Vatican II. And I don't just mean my book. I'm not just saying that. I mean the concepts. As you mentioned earlier, the very vocabulary of paracouncil. When I got that kind of understanding, when I got that paradigm, it's amazing how much that revolutionized my appreciation of the church and the current state of the church. When we know, oh, wait a second, there are categories to understand the political factions. There are categories to understand why we are where we are as a church. This helps people then to start easing the tensions. One of the greatest accomplishments of my life in the recent year since this book has been published has been the amount of people from both sides of the aisle, traditionalists and quote unquote progressives, who have sought me out and said, Father, after reading your book, now I understand, and I'm more open to dialoguing. And I'm going to go to the Extraordinary Forum this weekend. I want to go check it out. I didn't know Vatican II said that's okay. This
Beautiful.
looks pretty cool. And now they're going to the Extraordinary Forum Mass. And to see people from the SSPX approach me and who have read this book, and they're saying, Father, I had no idea. I joined the SSPX because of X, Y, or Z, but I had no idea about Vatican II. And they start coming to my parish and they want to meet with me and speak with me. That's what this is all about. If we start spreading that kind of knowledge and education, you're going to start seeing the friction melt away, and the real enemy is going to come to the fore, which is not Vatican II, but is misinformation, mistruth. That's the real enemy. The real enemy is this false narrative, is this really, if we want to take it to the most important theological level, this diabolical narrative that Satan has strewn to disrupt an ecumenical council of the church. Do not forget that an ecumenical council is the highest gathering of the mystical body of Jesus. Do not hesitate to think that Satan hates Vatican II. He does. Satan cannot stand Vatican II, and he wants it destroyed. So if we help in that narrative, we're going directly with the diabolical plan of the enemy on either side. So that's important for us to keep it in the forefront of our mind as well. So educate ourselves. And the number 3 is, after we educate ourselves and we're formed properly, to go ahead and start putting some of these things into practice. Start reading groups on Vatican II. Start educating yourself in Latin. Heck, if your local parish priest won't teach you, then you go and learn it yourself. I had to, ironically enough, and I was in a seminary, but that's a whole nother story. But I mean, I went and I taught myself Latin. I taught myself Koine Greek. I taught myself these things because I love the church and I love Vatican II. And this is what the Holy Spirit envisioned. And it's going to be a grind. But I will tell you that the millennial generation is one of the few pivotal generations in church history. And we have a choice to make. Either A, we're going to be a hinged generation that leads to the Second Vatican Council's full implementation and vision, or B, we're going to be a divisive generation that continues to perpetuate this false narrative and lead to greater factions within the church, possibly even a schism. So we have to be very mindful of that. And there was the last generation that was like ours was the generation probably of Charles Borromeo. So we're talking 16th, 17th century. But since then, there hasn't really been a generation in our exact position.
Okay, so I want to ask you a question about something you mentioned. The beauty of Vatican II and things like that, and Satan hates Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true that Paul VI said that the smoke of Satan entered into the church in Vatican II? Is that a real quote, or is that just one of those like legendary things?
No, yeah, that's definitely not something that's rooted in fact in any way, shape, or form. But I could tell you this. Yes, I would say that the smoke of Satan most certainly entered into Vatican II insofar as trying to disrupt its vision. I
Okay.
don't disagree with that. So let's say that St. Paul VI did say that. Again, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that, adamantly, and I'm open to learning. Maybe someone can send me a direct quotation from somewhere, and but if he did say that, I promise you that the Pope who helped close the council and called it a blessing in the life of the church, was most certainly not saying that about the council itself. I would say that Satan did what he always does. He takes something beautiful and he makes it ambiguous. This is what the enemy does, and that's why it's hard for me, the lack of discernment that's revolved around the Second Vatican Council. It's a very tragic thing, and I think it speaks also, of course, just to the lack of piety and religiosity in general. But we're so quick to get swept up into narratives before we do due diligence. We're so quick just to believe in something,
Yeah.
especially something discrediting the church.
Well, it's
And
everywhere. It's everywhere.
yeah, it's all over the place. So
Popular
before we
stuff.
believe in something that discredits an institution or discredits something, we really, I mean, we got to go deep. If we're going to claim that an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church is invalid, I pray to God you have a lot more to say to Jesus than a YouTube commentator's words whenever you stand before him and try to justify that. I mean, that's a bold, bold claim to say that a gathering of 2,500 bishops, the largest gathering ever of the magisterium in church history, is invalid or not real. That takes a lot of ammunition, and I don't know if we have enough of that. So that's something else I think is important for us to recognize, is that we really do need to accept the fact, the truth, that Vatican II was the will of God. And if that's the case, if the Holy Spirit willed the Second Vatican Council, then we have to ask ourselves, the next logical question is, what happened?
Yeah.
What happened? And that's what led to my book. I was like, so I had to presuppose that Vatican II is willed by the Spirit. And if I presuppose that, I most certainly know the Spirit doesn't will the destruction of faith. The Spirit doesn't will the disruption of the sacred liturgy. So something must have happened to disrupt this vision. And it could not be the vision itself. There has to be something else in between. That's just basic Thomistic logic. And so that's where we got the paracouncil and everything answered there.
Well, what I think is interesting, I mean, people are going to see this book, and I think there are going to be some people that initially are going to be repulsed by it because it talks, because it doesn't say Vatican II is the devil.
Right.
Okay? It doesn't say that.
Right.
But I think if they read it and they listen to what you're saying, I mean, you sound in this book like a very traditional guy, to a person who kind of is in that traditional world. I read this book. There weren't times when I took this book and went, oh, I don't agree with that.
Right.
Or, oh, that's the problem. That's not what I was. So those of you that are watching that are just like, you're thrown off by what sounds like Father is, he's defending something that you associate with,
dancing in front of the altar.
all of the garbage that happens in the abuses of the church or whatever. And you feel like this is defending that. You need to read this, because I would say this opens up a completely different way to interpret and understand what's going on in the contemporary world of the church. That is, I think, something that people need to look into, because if Vatican II isn't this horrible, evil thing like a lot of people say it is, then maybe reclaiming it and taking it back is the best way to move forward.
Yeah.
Because you now can stand on something that is real and that is definitive, not a reaction to an interpretation, but the actual thing. So anyway, I want you guys.
And what you're doing is you're taking the bludgeon, if you will, out of the hand of liberalism. So in paraconciliarism. So what's happened is paraconciliarists have used Vatican II for 50 years to hit people over the head to make changes that were not authentic.
Yeah. So
we got to take that away. You don't have the right to use an ecumenical council to tell me to stop speaking Latin.
Amen.
That is wrong. So we got to get that out of their hands and say, wait a second, Vatican II belongs to the Catholic Church. It doesn't belong to your ideology. It doesn't belong to your political agenda. It doesn't belong to your liturgical preference. It belongs to Catholicism. And that's where my book is coming from. I'm like, that's what the whole purpose of it is, reclaiming Vatican II from what? From this fake narrative.
Yeah.
From this paraconciliar narrative that's been strewn on both sides. And we need to go back and say Vatican II is a Catholic thing, and no one has the right to usurp that. And the only people who have the right are those of us who are trying to deeply know and understand the faith, to take the faith at its word. And so that's something else I think is important. So most certainly I'm right there with you. Please don't think that I'm trying to, again, defend hula hoop during the offering of the gifts or something. I most certainly, I am not at all doing that.
Very clear.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I have my fiddlebacks right here. Okay, so
Okay, so I
but
want to ask you one more question about
yeah.
this. What do you think is the most like beautiful thing that Vatican II says?
Oh my gosh, there's
You
so
had to pick
much.
just one. If you had to pick just like one thing that, I mean, and maybe it changes over time, but like right now, what's
Yeah.
the thing that you feel like is most needed slash beautiful that's actually in Vatican II?
Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22. That probably is the very center of the Second Vatican Council's theological mission, where it states Jesus Christ is the hope, the center, the pattern of all history and all of existence. He is the only hope for this world is Jesus Christ the Lord. If you are doubting the legitimacy of Vatican II, read Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22. It will blow your mind how Christocentric it is. And I would say, in my opinion, that is one of the most beautiful excerpts. I could add to that, of course, the excerpt on the sacred liturgy, how the sacrifice of the Holy Mass is the source and summit of the faith, and that there is no activity of the church that precedes or is greater than the sacred liturgy. So I would couple that quotation from Second Vatican Concilium, paragraph 10 and 11, along with Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22. And I think that really encapsulates the whole mission of the Second Vatican Council in such a wonderful way.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to do that. Thank you so much for writing this book, Father, and for coming on Catholic Feedback and talking to, a knucklehead like me who's feeling his way through this part of my Catholicism. But I've really appreciated this, and it's helped me to have a greater understanding of how to interpret some of these narratives that are coming at me personally from both sides of that spectrum. I feel like on one hand, I hear a lot of the traditionalist mindset, and I also hear a lot of the paracouncil mindset too. And I'm always trying to navigate through that. And this has been helpful to me. So where can people find out? Obviously, I'm going to link to this book in the description of this video, but is there any other place people can find out more about you or anything else that you'd like to point us to?
Most certainly. So first and foremost is Facebook and Instagram. You just look up Father Blake Britton on Facebook or Instagram, and I constantly update things there. You can find out where I'm giving talks. You can find out I do a book of the month every month. I do retreats, online retreats that are free and access to everybody. I do question and answer sessions that anybody could log into. So if you just like and follow my page and like and follow my Instagram, you'll be updated on everything. That's the best way to keep track of things. Also, I'm very blessed to do work with the Word on Fire Institute and Word on Fire. So you could look me up there. Just type in Father Blake Britton, Word on Fire, or Word on Fire Institute. And I do want to give a little shout out to a new initiative that I'm starting with Mr. Bob Angel, who's a fellow at the Institute of Word on Fire, which is a landmark series, really. No one's done anything quite like it yet on video games and evangelization, or God and Gaming is the name of the series. It's a YouTube mini series called God and Gaming. We just started it out. It is really, again, landmark. It's groundbreaking insofar as entering into this industry and really reflecting on why it is the most famous industry on the planet now. It is more popular than Hollywood or any other industry in the world. And what can we do to help evangelize this industry? And what are some of the deeper philosophical, theological reflections on the video game industry? So I do encourage you to check out with the Word on Fire Institute, the God and Gaming series, and all those different things. And I'm sure that I'll be doing more stuff in the future that you could always keep track of.
Well, I will check those things out. And of course, all those links will be down below in the description. This has been a fantastic time. The time's flown by for me. I'm sorry to take up more of your time. I know you're a parish priest. You've got things going on. You're a busy man. And we're grateful for your time and energy here today, Father. Thank you so much. And I appreciate it.
A real blessing for me, brother. Thank you for your hospitality. Outstanding conversation. And please know that I'm praying for you and all of your viewers and listeners.
Amen. Thank you so much, Father. Thank you. Wow, friends. Well, I pray that you have enjoyed this conversation with Father Blake Britton. And again, the book is called Reclaiming Vatican II, and I highly recommend it to all of you guys, my friends. If you have questions that you'd like to me to tackle here on Catholic Feedback, send them to me at feedback@catholicfeedback.com. I appreciate all of you guys for listening to this podcast, for watching, and for sharing. Until next time, my friends, make sure you do all you can to connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. Take care and God bless. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.